How big a departure is this? We've had a White House that put a lot into getting some changes to healthcare reform made. Now we see sort of a consolidation among the ranks to try to get tax reform.
Well, it's a change in the sense that with healthcare, the White House didn't really have a policy or a plan, and they first deferred to Paul Ryan, and then Trump came kind of storming in when he wanted some changes. Then they fell back in the Senate and deferred to Mitch McConnell again. I think the fact that they're marshaling their own team to go in and try and address some of these fights ahead of time instead of in real time is a sign that maybe they've learned from the failure of the healthcare bill.
Caroline, let me get a sense from you of where we are in this conversation about tax reform. I know you praised that joint statement from the Big Six, as they're called, saying some differences had been narrow. How big a divide is there still between all the parties, all the principals involved in this process?
Sure. I think, as you just said, we did praise the Big Six statement. We see it coming together at a high level. And I think we've seen that sort of develop more along the past couple weeks. You saw Director Cohn talk about, look, we need a rate, maybe not at 15%, but certainly that is closer to an OECD average, around 23%. You saw Senator Hatch on the Sunday shows last week sort of acknowledge maybe we're not getting to 15%. But you're kind of starting to see them parse out those differences. And even though they're, not in the exact same place, they're certainly, in the same ballpark.
Your boss said here, Tom Donahue said that failure is not an option. I wonder what constitutes failure. As we see the conversation shift to not permanence, a mix of permanent and temporary. Does that constitute failure? Is the Chamber's objective here to get permanent tax reform implemented?
I think ultimately right now at the beginning of the game, we view comprehensive pro-growth tax reform, as feasible, and we want it all right now.
Josh, let me ask you just about how much this conversation has changed. I mentioned the willingness to accept some temporary cuts here. Is it evolving? Is there a new sense of realism in Washington in light of what happened?
I think gradually there is. Initially, the White House was looking at Paul Ryan's tax plan, which would have funded tax reform with a border-adjusted tax. The so-called nationalists like Steve Bannon were very much on board with this plan, but essentially it was shut down and abandoned a couple of weeks ago. So that, coupled with the failure of passing the health care bill to free up money for tax reform, I think has awoken some people in the White House to the difficulty of doing tax reform, which would be difficult even with a more experienced president in the White House.